This video is a brief history of virus scares in the United States uh, since the 1970s in relation to the current coronavirus outbreak or scare. Depends on how you interpret it. Only time will tell what the coronavirus actually is, but it's a good time to go over some of the previous cases of concerns, scares, outbreaks of viruses in the United States. I'm going to give a sort of standard disclaimer here. I'm not a medical doctor. This is just general information, a starting point. It should not be used to diagnose, treat, or otherwise do anything as far as an actual illness. It's not intended to replace guidance from official bodies, the government, the CDC, and so forth. If you have health concerns and respiratory diseases, which is what I'm going to be talking about predominantly, can be fatal, as we'll show here, and they can be quite serious. I personally had a case where I had to go to an emergency room and had medical treatment and so forth. So if you have any concerns or issues of a medical nature, your personal health, you should seek a qualified medical medical doctors, etc. And this is not intended in any way to substitute for that. And as will be clear from my discussion, many people die from influenza, pneumonia, respiratory illnesses typically, and so it is a real concern. You should not take it lightly. So with that, let's set a little bit of context, because nearly all virus scares involve diseases that could be classified as influenza and/or pneumonia. Influenza and pneumonia, according to the Centers for Disease Control, are one of the leading causes of death in the United States. So in 2017, of course, the worst is heart attack, but 55,672 people, according to official statistics, died from influenza and pneumonia. And there may be some estimation and adjustment in these statistics, so it may not simply be a count of death certificates that have influenza or pneumonia or those types of diseases listed. I'm not familiar with exactly how the CDC produces these numbers. I know from some reading that some of the numbers they put out about deaths from the flu are adjusted in various ways, or at least that's been reported in the media. But nonetheless, this is probably fairly representative of how many people die from influenza and pneumonia recently. So this is data from 2017. This is the actual report from the CDC website. It gives pretty much the same numbers here, just to show that something a little more formal and official looking than the website. I think the relevant thing to keep in mind is that the death rates are very related to your age. So this is a breakdown. Now remember, very few people, for example, die as children, and even fewer people between the ages of 10 and about 50. So for example, things like accidents, suicide, murders, that sort of homicide here are the dominant causes of death up until about 50, where the incidence of things like heart attacks and disease starts to rise fairly substantially. However, it's generally reported or claimed that kids, particularly under the age of 5, have an immature immune system, and they have higher rates of death from, for example, influenza and pneumonia. So about according to this, in people ages 1 through 9 in 2017, 2.7% of those who died, which is not a large number, died of influenza and pneumonia. Ages 10 to 24, it drops to 0.7%. It isn't even listed for people 25 to 44, and as you can see, it is also not listed explicitly for ages 45 all the way up to 64. But as people get older, so this is 65 and over, and this is 85 and over. So for 65 and over, we see that 2.3% of those people, remember, most people die in old age in the United States, and most countries today actually, 2.3% die from influenza and pneumonia. If we take 85 and over, we get 2.8% dying from influenza and pneumonia. So this is because, in general, your health and your immune system in particular weakens as you get older, and you're more susceptible to a range of things, and specifically to infections, flus, things like that. Things that probably would bounce right off you when you're 25 can kill you as you get older. Now, there have actually been various scares over viruses and infections before 1976, but I'm going to start with the 1976 swine flu it's a little hard to call it an epidemic since there were almost no cases. Um, so this is a article from 1976, right after the election. So one of the things that happened here is that the Ford administration uh, promoted very heavily the idea that there was a possible epidemic of swine flu, which was supposedly the same disease that was responsible for for an influenza epidemic in 1918, 1919, right after World War I, which killed many, many people all over the world, many, many people in the United States. And so this was really hyped. And I think it's relevant to say that there were widespread doubts about it. So remember, Gerald Ford became president after the Republican president, Richard Nixon, resigned. He was threatened with impeachment and charged with obstruction of justice and a variety of other offenses, many of them related to the Watergate break-in. So that was a break-in into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., in which several people affiliated with the White House were arrested or found to be directing a break-in whose we're not quite sure of the purpose, but was thought to be political espionage or something else. There are some interesting theories about what they were looking for. Anyway, the point of this is this was a disaster for the Republicans. Ford became president sort of under a cloud. He pardoned Nixon, so there was never a full criminal court investigation or adjudication of what had actually happened. And he was facing both an insurgency from Ronald Reagan, who eventually became president and the Republican nominee in 1980. He was also facing, of course, the Democrats from a very weak position, obviously. So there was widespread sort of suspicions by people that this was being whipped up to create kind of a crisis environment, sort of the wag the dog scenario in which the country would rally around the president and it would really benefit him in the election. It did not. He lost the election, but and this whole handling of the swine flu epidemic was heavily criticized, notably by, for example, more Democratic Party friendly sources like the New York Times here. Now, another thing that is worth mentioning is that this was heavily stoked by an outbreak of, again, respiratory illnesses in the summer. So let's see if I have a, here we go. Okay, so this is kind of forgotten today, but this is the 1976 Philadelphia Legionnaires Disease outbreak. Now, this was originally presented as an outbreak of swine flu, and there's a mention of it here in the Wikipedia article. So let's see if I can re-find that. Okay, so complicating the situation was a fear among the public that the original cluster of 14 cases, 6 of whom died within a few days of each other, represented an outbreak of swine flu. The total number of cases reached 211, and of those, 29 had died. Okay, so it kind of puts it on the public rather than, say, the Centers for Disease Control of the government that was promoting this swine flu epidemic, which in fact never happened. Lots of people were vaccinated, several hundred people came down with Guillain-Barré syndrome. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it quite right, but Guillain-Barré syndrome is a neurological illness very similar to polio in its symptoms, which can be caused by it's thought to be caused by an autoimmune reaction triggered by vaccination, or at least that's one of the causes of it. It's pretty rare. I don't think it's very well understood, but obviously it's pretty bad when you vaccinate people and you end up crippling and killing people with the vaccine. So a point that is relevant here is this was the American Legion. These are elderly, former, I think some of them are current military military veterans. So actually it's not just Army here. For example, we have a U.S. Air Force captain and an American Legion bookkeeper who was 61 years old, apparent heart attack. As we mentioned earlier, let me go back to the thing here. Respiratory infections like Legionnaires' disease, which was eventually blamed on a bacterium, not on the swine flu, but it was the publicity in the summer, and I remember watching this. It was the atmosphere about swine flu was somewhat similar to the current atmosphere about coronavirus, and the coronavirus is one of the most heavily publicized, I would say it is by far the most heavily publicized virus scare since the swine flu in the 1970s, since this one. But the point is, of course, that older people are at much higher risk of dying from influenza and pneumonia than younger people. Deaths from influenza, pneumonia, other respiratory illnesses are concentrated in the elderly, probably because their immune systems weaken with age and are no longer as effective as they are when we're 25 or 30 or even teenagers. I mean, so that's why a quote outbreak of something um, at a basically a convention of American Legion members, most of whom are in their 60s and 70s and 80s. We have one age 39, one 82. Um, Tiredness, chest pain, lung congestion, and fever. Again, those are very common symptoms. They're what we see with many different viruses, many bacteria, uh, a number of toxins, etc. So eventually, actually in January of 1977, so remember, this is after the election. A new administration is in power, which is to gung-ho the Republican Ford administration swine flu epidemic, or is coming into power, I should say. They don't actually, the inauguration is a little bit after January of 1977. So they attribute it to this Legionella bacterium and found to be breeding in the cooling tower, the hotel air conditioning system, et cetera, et cetera. And this, it's worth remembering, this was actually one of the most highly publicized scares about a virus in U.S. history. And there was more publicity about it, and it was on the news, I think, if not nightly, very frequently. So remember, this is before the internet. Most people get their information either from ABC, NBC, or CBS News on broadcast television, or to some degree, newspapers like the New York Times and a few national magazines like Newsweek and Time. For example, it's fair to say that the New York Times probably had more influence. This is an archival article about it from the New York Times from 1976. So the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal at that time were the two major national newspapers. So in some respects, your news, especially your national, international news, then was much more, in a way, concentrated than it is today with the internet in a few media companies and in a few things like ABC, CBS, NBC, a couple of major newspapers, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and a couple of these magazines like Time and Newsweek. So it got a lot of publicity, and it was generally perceived at the time after it that it's basically a fiasco. Almost no one died from swine flu, actually. And in fact, a number of people. So here we go. One person, a young soldier named David Lewis, died of a new form of flu. This is the precipitating event in '76. And this led to this whole, scare in which many millions of people were vaccinated, and many people caught, again, this is Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare neurological disorder, after getting the 1976 flu shot. Of course, not surprisingly, the CDC kind of plays down Guillain-Barré syndrome. Again, it has some symptoms that are fairly similar to polio. Well, there have been many other scares about various viruses since then. They include a couple of different scares related to the Hantavirus, which is found in certain rodents and has actually killed very few people in the United States. This is a recent Hantavirus scare. I remember hearing about it in the 80s and early 90s. This is a Yosemite National Park outbreak, so-called. A few people got sick. I think a few people died in 2012. Let's see. This is another article about the 2012 quote outbreak. Again, supposedly from the Hantavirus. Yeah, it was. You started hearing about it in '93. Here we go. Killed 31 otherwise healthy young people living in the Four Corners area bordering Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah. Keep in mind how small these numbers are. Let's go right back here to influenza pneumonia. Over 55,000 people, and it's true it's rarer in young people, but it's not that young people never die from influenza pneumonia and things like that. It's just less common. So let's get back to the Hantavirus. Now this is a 1995 movie that was clearly inspired heavily by coverage of Ebola, I would say, and maybe Hantavirus at the time in the early 90s. And so this stars Dustin Hoffman, Rene Russo, Morgan Freeman, and it basically features a very common formula that you saw at that time. A lot of the fears have shifted more to China and Asia the last couple decades, but here we have some infected monkeys from Africa come to the U.S. They throw up on people or something. They infect really healthy young people who get super sick and die. It has a whole melodrama where the government tries to quarantine and then exterminate the it's supposed to be some rural island community in Northern California. By northern, we were well north of San Francisco towards Oregon, out in the country. And supposedly the military is actually able to contain these rural people in their community, and they're nearly killed. But of course, the hero prevents it, and the CDC comes up with a vaccine for it. It's all very melodramatic, but it's an example of the kind of stuff you see about these outbreaks, where the viruses are depicted as incredibly contagious, incredibly dangerous, and it's the virus alone that causes the deaths. It's not. There's usually very little indication of the age-related nature of the deaths that we see with most of these actual diseases. Um, so the impression is that you could be 25 and this super disease from Africa could get here somehow and kill you. Um, there's been a shift, as I said, from Africa to more like China and Southeast Asia in recent decades. So let's go here. This is Ebola. There was a whole bunch. Look at this. There was a 2014 Ebola scare, and there was actually an earlier scare, the first Ebola scare here. But look at this. Cases contracted in U.S. 2, cases first diagnosed in U.S. 4, cases evacuated to U.S. from other countries 7. These get a lot of publicity. Total deaths 2. Now, admittedly, this is Wikipedia, and you should take Wikipedia with a grain of salt. But again, despite a lot of hype for a few months, and the typical pattern of most of these, other than the swine flu, is that the total publicity lasts a year or two. You get a few months of, oh my God, this is the Black Death or smallpox for the American Indians. I will talk about that in a minute. It's a super disease. If we don't somehow do something, we're going to get wiped out. And much like the swine flu, very few people contract it. Very few people actually die from it, for many of these virus scares. That doesn't mean the diseases aren't real. It doesn't mean they aren't dangerous. It's just that the hype about it is orders of magnitude beyond what actually happens. And that hype initially is often from experts. It's not just from the National Enquirer or something like that. These things are reported in major, supposedly reputable newspapers, and the CDC is often playing a big role in promoting this scare. And then, oh well, okay, new thing. This is an article about SARS, which is actually supposed to have been a type of coronavirus from China. Has a lot of parallels to coronavirus. Here we go. Here's bird flu. That was another one that came through. Here is an article in The Nation, a left-wing, generally considered a left-wing. I don't know which billionaire finances it, but it's generally considered a left-wing sort of opinion editorial new magazine. And here's some criticism of sort of, again, overreaction to the threat of a bird flu pandemic is the language here. There's usually, as happened with the swine flu, kind of a backlash. It's pretty quiet. The swine flu, of course, got much more publicity, but there's usually some backlash where some people and medical experts point out that actually not very many people died. There's other serious diseases, and of course, things like what I pointed out, that these things often, would be classified as influenza and pneumonia deaths, that there's actually a lot of people, mostly elderly people, died. And it also seems to be fairly common that's indeed who dies disproportionately in these virus scares where there actually are deaths. Having said that, keep in mind that younger people do die from influenza and pneumonia. Sometimes people who have we can't explain it in any known health issue that they have. So your likelihood of dying from something like influenza and pneumonia is probably higher if you have some other health issue. You've had an accident, you've had some other illness, obviously malnutrition, which I'll get to in a moment. There are a number of factors that can lead to people being at higher risk even if they're not elderly. So people are affected by our general culture, our education system, which promotes the idea of super diseases. And in fact, when I was younger, I pretty much accepted that idea. Most people have probably heard of the Black Death, which killed a very large, let's switch back over here. Okay, so the Black Death. So this is a mysterious disease which killed somewhere, the numbers vary all over the map. I've seen as low as maybe 10 or 15% occasionally to half the population of Europe around the mid 1300s. So here it's showing the apparent spread of the disease. Um, for example, its peak was about, I think, 1348. It's usually blamed. There's a whole story. Again, one of the things you find consistently, here we go. Let me just tell you this story and make a point. Origin and incidence, this is for the Black Death in the 1300s. Having originated in China and Inner Asia, the Black Death decimated the army of the Kipchak Khan Janibeg while he was besieging the Genoese trading port of Kaffa, now Feodossia, in Crimea, 1347. With his forces disintegrating, Janibeg catapulted plague-infested corpses into the town in an effort to infect his enemies. From Kaffa, Genoese ships carried the epidemic westward to Mediterranean ports, whence it spread inland, affecting Sicily, 1347, North Africa, mainland Italy, Spain, and France, 1348, and Austria, Hungary, Switzerland, Germany, and the Low Countries, 1349. A ship from Calais carried the plague to Melcombe Regis, Dorset, that's England, in August 1348. It reached Bristol almost immediately and spread rapidly throughout the southwestern counties of England. London suffered most violently between February and May 1349. East Anglia and Yorkshire during that summer. The Black Death reached the extreme north of England, Scotland, Scandinavia, and the Baltic countries in 1350. So notice that the disease is supposedly imported from foreign countries. That's a very consistent claim of great age. It's found in ancient times as well as today. There's some striking things about polio, where you can find documentaries blaming polio outbreaks. Now, polio had been observed in the United States in the 1920s. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was diagnosed with polio and became crippled supposedly because of polio in the 1920s. But you can find documentaries that are blaming the outbreaks, purported outbreaks in the 40s and 50s, on returning servicemen coming from the Pacific Islands. So again, almost always a disease outbreak will be blamed on something external, and blaming other countries is very, very common. And as you will notice, that's very common in the virus scares. It's Spanish influenza, it's from China, it's from Africa. It's never symptomatic of something happening in the country. So the reason I mention that is that Europe had a lot of problems at the time of the Black Death. There was a lot of population, there was a lot of poverty and malnutrition. The Black Death was actually something like the third of a series of increasingly worse plague and disease outbreaks that had started in the early 1300s. There's no hint in this account of that. But the reality is that we can explain outbreaks in other ways that involve something happening in the region where the disease actually appears. And indeed, it could seem to spread across the world because different countries copy each other, are influenced by one another, not because a disease organism that's already endemic is spreading by people. And what I want to make an interesting point is the organisms which are now blamed for the Black Death, like Yersinia pestis and Pasteurella pestis and so forth. See here, microscopic image, bacterium that causes plague. These are found in rodents. Let me scoot over here. Sorry, that's wrong. Anyway, these are actually found in rodents in the southwestern United States fairly often. Yet we don't get plague outbreaks, anything like the Middle Ages or anything at all. Every now and then, like a hiker or somebody will come down with the Black Plague, or I should say the Black Death, the bubonic plague, and you'll get hysterical news articles about it saying, oh my God, probably a significant number of hikers and other people living in the Southwest are exposed to it, get it, recover from it, and never even go to see a doctor. I don't see how that could not happen, right? How do we possibly stop people from getting exposed to rodents in the southwestern United States? The answer, of course, or not the answer, but the likely scenario is we're much healthier today than people in the 1300s. We're bigger. We have a lot of body fat, actually, so we have a lot of energy reserves. We have clean water. We have plenty of food. We have probably other things we don't even realize help us deal with diseases. So this, anyway, the Black Death is usually discussed in schools in history. It is, let me fiddleback over here. Yeah, okay. So it's actually mentioned fairly prominently in the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer, which is often taught in high schools. I read the Canterbury Tales when I was the equivalent of a senior in high school. And so people are really exposed to this, and it's usually presented the way it is in the Encyclopedia Britannica. There's no suggestion that there could have been, for example, malnutrition in Europe that contributed to the outbreak. No discussion, let's say, inequality, where the nobility are eating up too much of the resources. These things are completely invisible in these accounts that you're taught in school. What you're taught is a super disease that's able to overcome immune systems of perfectly healthy people has come in from another country, from other people, often enemies or potential enemies, and it's going to wipe you out. And of course, something like this seemingly happened in the 1300s. It's not the only one in U.S. culture. So here we go, the idea of smallpox in the American Indians. So if you read U.S. history, and actually this is true in Central and South America, so when the Europeans came into contact with the American Indians, one of the things that happened is that there were outbreaks of smallpox. Those outbreaks of smallpox affected both the Europeans, invaders, settlers, whatever you want to call them, and the Indians. But the Indians had, in many cases, much higher mortality rates. In fact, there are reports of entire tribes, large populations, basically being wiped out with virtually no survivors in some of these early accounts. Now, that clearly didn't happen everywhere. There are many people who are obviously American Indian, either completely or largely in ancestry in the southwestern United States, in southern Mexico, for example, parts of Central America, some areas of the Andes, and so forth. So some groups don't seem to have been as badly affected, but in some areas the loss of life was reportedly extremely high. And so the idea that you're taught in school is typically something along the lines of, there had been no contact whatsoever prior to Columbus between the Indians and the Europeans. Sometimes they'll say, well, they were the Vikings, but they had no real effect. They were only in Newfoundland or whatever for a short period of time, so we can sort of rule them out. So the Indians were not immune to European diseases, and therefore they got totally wiped out. Of course, the problem is, why didn't the Europeans get wiped out by some, disease the American Indians had, which was, they had had no contact with for, again, the idea is that the Indians came here, are descended from a small group of people who crossed the Bering Land Strait about a now sunken land bridge between what's now eastern Siberia and Alaska, and they had come over in this one small group. And it used to be said about 9,000 BC. It's been pushed back a couple thousand years because of, archaeological discoveries that there pretty clearly were human beings in the New World. I think they're now dated back to about 11,000 or 12,000 BC. So the point of all this is supposedly these people were totally isolated from the Europeans, from Asia, from all of this for 10,000, 12,000 years. They weren't immune to these, never encountered smallpox or something similar, so they die in huge numbers. And of course, why didn't the same thing happen to the Europeans? And so then you get into these kind of weird acrobatics to try to explain that. I don't have an explanation for why the differential rate of death occurred. I mean, there are many accounts that indicate it did, but this is what you're taught. So again, the idea that the disease by itself, without any environmental conditions, can kill healthy, vibrant young people. And the Indians are often described as in really good health. They're 6 feet something. They're taller than the Europeans. They have good teeth. They're great. And then they start dying from smallpox. So these things build in us an expectation that this is how the diseases work, even though a lot of our actual empirical experience at this point is very different. Again, our empirical experience is that these contagious diseases, influenza and pneumonia here, kill mostly elderly people or people who have some kind of pre-existing health problem or issue. And keep in mind, those cases where we can't find any pre-existing health issue doesn't mean that those people don't have a pre-existing health issue that we just don't know about. We don't know how to measure or detect. So this is intended to kind of present these virus scares in some context and how we think about them. So what I would say is things that happened with the American Indians or the Black Death are people hundreds of years ago who did not have, for example, treated water. They did not have the kind of food and food uh, treatment and cleanliness and other issues. Many things have changed since then. And many of those changes have been accompanied, I don't show the figures here, but they have been accompanied by remarkable drops in both the incidence and mortality rate of all sorts of infectious diseases. These appear in a lot of the statistics to be fairly independent of vaccines and antibiotics, which are very emphasized as the explanation. So it's probable that vaccines and antibiotics have genuinely helped, but there's a lot of evidence that there are other factors as to why people are much healthier today, why the incidence and mortality rates for infectious diseases are much lower than they used to be. And indeed, people of American Indian ancestry, I would say, no longer suffer these kind of things, these kind of problems. We don't have smallpox outbreaks in southern Mexico killing millions of people, as is described hundreds of years ago. Of course, you can say, well, they got immune and everything, but then the immunity isn't inherited. Well, the people who were especially vulnerable got killed, and it's sort of Darwinian selection. You can get around any argument like that. So what would I say in conclusion? If you look at the history, every couple of years we have some kind of, generally it's a virus. Usually the virus is attributed to a foreign country, either Africa or now China, Southeast Asia, as where it came from. Often they will say it came from some animal. Somebody ate a chimpanzee or they ate bats or something, and that's how it somehow now appeared as a new thing. It was never there before. And that goes way back to accounts of the Black Death. And in the Black Death, all kinds of weird things. There were claims that people were putting deadly poisons, powders of some sort, in wells, and that you often hear about how Jews in particular were targeted, but they were blaming lepers, vagabonds, what we call homeless people. Probably they were just blaming random people. And there were investigations, and there are eyewitness accounts of things like that happening. And they often, at the time, this is the time of the Crusades, they blamed it specifically on the Muslims and witches, and it's way out there by modern standards what they thought was going on. So the point is, we get these virus scares every couple of years. Often the total number of people killed is way smaller than these annual figures for influenza and pneumonia deaths, which are 55,000 something in the U.S. This is 2017. So how should people deal with that? I think what it argues for is caution. Just because genuine super disease outbreaks at most must be very rare. I mean, whatever was called the Black Death, and maybe it's not Yersinia pestis or Pasteurella pestis, or the bacteria we blame on it. We blame it on today. Maybe it was something else that we really don't know about. Maybe that's why the mortality figures were so high. Certainly a super disease outbreak where the super disease can kill really healthy people in their 20s, and it has nothing to do with age or pre-existing health problems or malnutrition. It can really take out a lot of people. We can't rule that out. It could happen. Based on past experience, we can say that it usually doesn't. Usually the outbreaks or scares have proven to be greatly exaggerated. It's easy in the modern world to see why various groups might exaggerate the risk and hype the risk of a super disease, a Black Death-like disease that can kill large numbers of healthy young people. That can get funding for your government agency. It can sell possibly useless vaccines. It can generate, clicks. It can generate, advertising revenues for newspapers and websites and so forth. So there's lots of reasons that people and politicians might hype this risk. On the other hand, we can't rule it out either, which makes it a good thing to hype, because it would be irresponsible to claim that this could never happen, that we couldn't have some super disease outbreak. Clearly, it's debatable whether the historical examples like the Black Death are genuinely super diseases like that, since they occurred in periods where there was a lot of poverty, malnutrition. The water was frequently contaminated, dirty, full of parasites and other things which we know degrade people's health and ability to fight off various other health issues. So it's difficult to pull these apart and say we have a clear case of a super disease which can kill, healthy people, modern people in their 20s, um, and again, the total number of deaths that you could attribute to a super disease, like in these outbreaks, since it doesn't spread, it's very possible those people just were very unlucky, or so young people who died from Hantavirus or something. It's possible, otherwise perfectly healthy. Well, there may have been some bad luck, or they were exposed to some toxin of some sort, pollution, something in the atmosphere that we can't detect or didn't notice, things like that. So all we can say here for sure is there's a long history of these scares, and I did not include scares predating the swine flu quote epidemic. I mean, almost nobody came down with it. Almost nobody died from it in 1976. The Legionnaires, outbreak, or what's now called the Legionnaires Disease outbreak, was not the swine flu, and it was touted as if it was for a few months, but it wasn't. But if you go back, there were scares about viruses in the 1960s, 1950s, and so forth, which follow pretty much the same pattern of a very few deaths and so forth. So in conclusion, this has been a brief history of virus scares in the United States. And again, this is, of course, general information. It's a starting point. It's for educational, informational purposes only. I am not a qualified, medical person, medical doctor, anything like that. And also, as I would say, and I can say from personal experience, respiratory illnesses, other illnesses too, but respiratory illnesses can be fatal. They can kill you. They can happen to people who are seemingly healthy, and you should take them seriously and seek proper, medical, expertise, people who are qualified medical doctors and so forth, and not disregard your health. And remember that the rule of thumb is you can survive for 4 minutes without oxygen. So it doesn't take very long for respiratory failure, something happening in your lungs, to kill you. So it's not to be taken lightly, especially if you're older or whatever. But in any case, you definitely shouldn't ignore the risk, because there's clearly a history of exaggeration of a lot of these supposed virus outbreaks. Nonetheless, a respiratory illness can kill you, and it's a serious thing. You should take it in your health very seriously. And that concludes this video. If you like this video, please take a moment to click like. Please click subscribe and the notification bell if you would like to receive more content from us. We welcome constructive feedback and comments. Mathematical software is developing products and services to automate data analysis, reducing the risks of costly errors and improving results. If you want to support our work, you can subscribe on our Patreon page. This is the URL for our Patreon page. Scan the QR code in the lower right corner with your smartphone to get the Patreon link. Our Patreon link is also in the show notes below.